guys know how incredible the world is today and how much power you have? I hope that at the end of this time, that's the key thing you're going to get from the presentation I'll give you. The technology that you're using is actually, once you graduate, will give you far more power than the bosses you're going to be working for. And if you haven't seen how to apply what you're learning in IT now, let me show you some of the real-world applications that we've seen and that we're playing with. Innovation in a changing world. I'm sure that's been the theme of the last few days that you guys have been here. Okay, let's start with the things I do. I do news. And I guess we'll start with the biggest event in the last 2 years that's actually captured the two main behaviors that's pushed technology to the forefront. And there are two words I want you to keep in mind. The first is social networks. How many of you guys have a Facebook account? Raise your hand if you have a Facebook account. Sorry, yeah, can you kill the spotlight so I can see? Okay, raise your... How many have a Twitter account? Wow, you're very connected. Parang there's many Twitter and Facebook. That's great. Right now, there are 33 million Filipinos on the internet. 96 to 97% of those Filipinos are on Facebook. This is part of what we'll show you. So the first is social networks. The second word is emotions. Many of us think we're rational people, but one of the things that neuropsychology has actually shown is that we're actually far more emotional. We make decisions because of emotion. So let's look at what happened here. Sorry, let's go back. We go back still, right? So when it happened in 2009, we had these big events in the Middle East. It's called the Arab Spring. And for whatever reason, it spread two things. It spread the emotion of courage. It spread anger through large groups of people. And it also toppled dictators. It spread it through social networks. And so one of the things when I was looking at it in 2011, trying to figure out how did this happen? These dictators were there for 30 to 40 years. What happened in 2011 that made social media such a huge factor in this? Well, here's what happened. In 2009, social media hit a tipping point. And when it hit that tipping point, it took just another year and a half before you could see it move events around the world. So what's the first thing? What did happen in 2009? Well, why is everyone talking about social media? Parang isa pa, there. Because of these really, really big numbers. Look at the numbers. If it were a country, this doesn't. So if it were a country, back, yeah. The one with Facebook, right? So if it were a country, Facebook would be the third largest country in the world. You can see all these other statistics. I can email them to you if you're interested in them. But I'm not interested in the other statistics. The one I'm most interested in is that one in the middle. The one that says, in 2009, and it was in June of 2009, social media overtook pornography as the number one activity on the internet. Alam ko, hindi kayo nagpa-pornography, no? But pornography is the number one activity on the web up until June of 2009. And then what happened in June 2009? Many more Filipinos, people around the world joined social media. And that's the thing I wanted to do in 2011. I wanted to try to figure out what is it that made people gravitate to social media. And what can social media do? There are other things that happened. With this new technology, you can literally see the shape of events. You know when you're looking at an anthill, when you see a long line of ants and you follow them and they're in an anthill, parang you have a God's eye view of that ant's world. Well, this new technology now allows us to have a God's eye view of how we behave as people. Over there, Chart A is the Twitter map of Japan, the Fukushima reactor disaster. So take a look at it. You can see it. It's broadcasting out, people looking for information. On B, on the left side, you can see hashtag GOP. It's one of the Republican events in the United States before the Republican convention. Look at what happened. You can see the shape. Very, very polarized. You have Democrats on one side and Republicans on the other side. Now take a look at what the Twitter hashtag in Egypt looked like at the time of the revolt. Parang sumabog siya, di ba? Sumabog siya talaga. That is what it looks like. Now, the last one is D. So C is Egypt and D is Syria. Right now, you're talking of about 20,000 people killed in 18 months of violence in Syria. And that's what it looks like when you map what people are doing on Twitter. So you can see the shape of things, of our activity on social media. And that's why it's game-changing. So let's go to the people. How do we behave when we're part of this big charts and maps? Why is it that we prefer this Facebook, Twitter over? What drives us to Facebook and Twitter? Why do a lot of people prefer it now over pornography? It's actually simple. It starts with you and the chemical makeup of your body and the way your brain is working. Before it used to be, people said that television, the medium defines the message. This is Marshall McLuhan. If you're a communications person studying that, Marshall McLuhan defined the text. He said that the medium is the message. Now we're going beyond the medium. The medium is actually rewiring your brains. Did you ever notice that when you sit down on Facebook, it's very hard to get away from it because you're mildly addicted to it? This is what happens when you're on Facebook. There are two chemicals that are elevated in your body. The first chemical is something called dopamine. Dopamine causes mild addiction to gambling. It gives you a little high. It's not as high as adrenaline, but it gives you this lift. And when you get that lift, you keep wanting more. So you keep coming back to it. Dopamine levels increase with Twitter and Facebook use. And how did they figure this out? They put students like you under a brain scan. They did brain scans of people who were on Facebook. fMRI is functional magnetic resonance imaging studies. So you're on Facebook and your Twitter, and they're monitoring the way your brain is reacting and the chemical levels in your body. The other chemical that increases in your body is a chemical called oxytocin. Oxytocin is also called the love hormone, the sex hormone. If you hug someone for longer than 6 seconds, your body starts producing higher levels of oxytocin. If your mother has just given birth, her body is full of oxytocin. Oxytocin is a fundamental human need. In Maslow's, for the psych majors, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, number 3 is the human need to connect. And that's oxytocin that fuels that. So when you have higher levels of dopamine and you have higher levels of oxytocin, you're addicted and you want to connect. So that's basically what happens when you're on social media. So this technology that you're using, now we know you have at least two chemicals in your body that pumps you up emotionally, that makes you slightly addicted to it. But the next part is that you're using cell phones. Anyone who uses a cell phone, if you're talking to a friend, listening to a professor, if you're here and then that cell phone interrupts with a text message, it rewires your brain for that instance because it takes your focus and your attention away. If that constantly keeps happening, you literally change the pathways, the neural pathways of your brain. So that's how you're actually changing your brain waves. What does that mean for you guys? Well, there's a downside. And here's the downside of this dopamine fix. A recent study showed that students on Facebook don't do as well in school. This generation, your generation, is a generation that can't focus, is bad at multitasking, even though you think you're good at it. And you can't concentrate. That's not all negative naman. We don't want to stay in the negatives, diba? When progress moves forward, something else comes in, and there is something else. So let's go to the positives of it. Look at the positives of what happens, though. You're more engaged. You're more social. And you can decide, many times for free. Facebook is free. Twitter is free. You can decide to act together, which means you can decide to do things in the real world that you couldn't have done before social media. Here's the other thing. My professors, when I was still in college, when I was your age, and that was a very long time ago, used to tell me that it's not just the book learning that's important, it's about the social networks you create. It's the friends you make. And that phrase, you are the friends you keep, it's very important, and even more important now than it was before, because you guys are social networking before you're out of school on a scale that my generation couldn't have thought about. So what does that mean? What can you do with these ideas? How can you use them for positive change? I'm sure you use Facebook to stay in touch with your family and friends, but many Filipinos are using Facebook to help in disasters. They're using Facebook to try to help elevate the level of political discussion. They're using Facebook for a whole lot of other things. And I guess this is where we come in. I've been a journalist for almost 30 years. I'm much older than I look. And one of the things I realize is that my profession is changing so fast. And if I do not embrace it and try to find a way to look for it and to take it with me, the broadcast journalism I knew will change, and I'll be holding on to nothing. And that is the dilemma for traditional news organizations. Let me tell you what we decided to do. So, if you haven't heard about Rappler, Rappler is just a purely online entity. We don't exist in the real world, well, except for the fact that I'm standing in front of you. But Rappler isn't like a TV station. Even though we do TV, we call it video. Rappler is purely online, and people discover us by word of mouth. People discover us through social media. So what are we? Our core is professional journalism, except it's changing. Because the minute bloggers came into the scene, traditional journalists had to adapt. Traditional journalists won't admit it, but that's part of the dynamics that's there. The second circle is something called the wisdom of crowds, crowdsourcing. If you've used Wikipedia, Wikipedia is crowdsourcing at work. That's the best example. What is it? It's an encyclopedia. It's 2.3 million pages that's created by people all over the world who aren't told what to do, who aren't paid to write, to report, to research, who aren't told to correct mistakes. And yet, Wikipedia, on the average, has the same number of errors as Encyclopedia Britannica. And this year, Encyclopedia Britannica just announced they would stop printing. You may not see it, but it's changing now. So, Wikipedia, crowdsource. Crowdsourcing is a huge thing that we wanted to tap. And the last circle is technology. This is where we stand, where Rappler is, where technology built, rich media built into the stories with a blend of expert, that is our professional journalists, and the wisdom of crowds. When you put those three things together, you create something different. Okay, so here's the other part that I was saying. You know, even though we're not a TV station, we do TV, we do video. And did you know that Filipinos upload and download the most number of videos each day on YouTube? We upload and download the most. We're on the net all the time. If you look at Nielsen last year, the amount of time you spend on media in the Philippines, on print, you spend roughly 3.3 hours a week reading a paper. You spend 6.2 hours a week listening to radio. On TV, it goes up to 12.5 hours a week. But on the internet, you're there 21.5 hours a week. So the media you consume, but here's the part that's interesting to me about the video that you consume there. Every story, whether it's video, text, or just a photo, has a mood meter. And the mood meter has 8 emotions. There are only 6 here, but the mood meter has 8 emotions for you to choose from. Why is that important? Because the neuroscientist said that 80% of how we make decisions as people is based on how we feel. It's based on emotions. And emotions spreads through 3 degrees of influence in a crowd. That's the other part that's interesting. So when you look at that, 80% of how you make decisions is based on how you feel. And here's the last corollary to that. If you identify how you feel, if you're angry and your friend says, "How do you feel?" and you say, "I'm angry," you're actually more prone to listen to reason. You're more prone to be rational if you are self-aware that you are angry or happy or sad. So if when you click how you feel on the mood meter, that vote goes to the mood navigator, you become a little more rational and you actually help crowdsource the mood of the day. So it goes to the mood navigator, which is at the middle of the page, and you actually can see the mood, the crowdsourced mood of the day. It's interesting, Rappler began in January, and during the impeachment trials, Mondays through Thursdays, very angry lahat ng tao. So you see anger as the mood of the day, Mondays through Thursdays, then Friday, Saturday, it starts to turn just slightly green, and maybe on Sunday, it will turn green, happy or inspired. Except the day that the defense held a press conference, it was very angry that day again. When someone dies, the death of Dolphy, he died on a Tuesday night at 9 p.m. Within a few hours, the mood navigator turned gray, sad. And it was sad all the way until the day he was buried on a Sunday. And then within an hour or two, the mood navigator turned inspired. Filipinos don't stay in the negative emotions that long. The minute he was buried, we looked at what he left behind, at his legacy. And that was the same thing that happened to Jesse Robredo. So you can see the wave of emotions going through society. That's the way we behave in the virtual world. But the virtual world is nothing if it's not anchored in the real world. And this is part of the reason we do the Move Philippines chat series. You need to see how you can use your cell phone, how you can use your computer, how you can use this new technology to actually make things better. I believe that's possible, and I'm staking my professional life on that.